First, it was great seeing you. Now I think I get to see you and hear you. So why don't we just test that?
Yeah, great.
There you are. Okay.
Hey, Glenn, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can. All right, Maz, congratulations on this reporting. Before we get into the details of this reporting and the implications of it, I want to ask you instead first about some of the releases today, because I'll give you my impression, you tell me yours. Obviously, there's some salacious stuff in there that can be politically embarrassing to Trump. You have Jeffrey Epstein saying that Virginia Giuffre, who's one of the main Epstein victims, spent a lot of time at Jeffrey Epstein's house along with Donald Trump. The Democrats redacted her name, even though it was very obvious who they were talking about, in part because she is proven to be, and you can ask Michael Tracy and he'll tell you for 8 hours the proof of this, kind of a serial fabulous. She made allegations against Alan Dershowitz that she had to withdraw. A lot of what she said ended up being disproven, so I think they were kind of eager to separate her from these allegations. So you have that. You have Jeffrey Epstein telling other people that Trump did have knowledge of what Jeffrey Epstein was doing. You have Michael Wolff, the kind of discredited journalist who was talking to Jeffrey Epstein in some of these emails about how he could blackmail Trump, basically, how he could use this information that he has about what Trump knew to gain influence with Donald Trump. But to me, the much more interesting and proven component of these emails is what I said earlier, you may have heard, which is that, I mean, it's hard to even list the people, Peter Thiel and Larry Summers and world leaders and leaders of every major bank who Jeffrey Epstein was just constantly talking to after his conviction for soliciting a minor for prostitution. And they just didn't seem to care in the slightest that was the case. He lost no standing whatsoever in this world of the highest level of political and financial power. What do you make of today's releases?
Well, first of all, Glenn, thank you for having me on because it's been sort of interesting to see the lack of response to these very consequential revelations contained in these communications from Epstein. It's almost as though it's being consciously ignored. And it's fascinating seeing the emails come out today because I kind of agree with what you said. There's a bit of a red herring in these emails. Now, this is not to downplay the very grave nature of the crimes, the sexual crimes that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in, that he committed and he ultimately went to prison for. And that is a very important issue, and the victims and the people involved, that should all be publicly known. But in the intense focus on the salacious details and the attempt to, I guess, embarrass certain political figures who are currently in power at the moment, like Trump, there's a huge other part of the story which is just being ignored, which is not being talked about at all, which kind of hints at what you're talking about. How did Jeffrey Epstein have this enormous Rolodex of people? You named very well-known American figures. He was well-connected in Africa, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in Russia, in Europe. He knew people all over the world at the topmost levels in business, finance, and technology fields, government and military. He was extremely well-connected individual, and he was using these connections to accomplish specific geopolitical goals for certain countries, as well as economic goals, making money for other people, accomplishing specific political objectives. And we've written about a few of these stories in the past week. You touched on some of them in your introduction there. We're going to do more of that reporting. But in all the focus on the salacious details, and I'm not saying it should not be focused on at all, it is important, there's been pretty much a blackout on this other part of the Epstein story, which in my view is the more consequential part of the story, the more revealing part, and the part which I think there's a conscious effort presently to suppress, or, to use a term of art, do a limited hangout. We'll talk about certain parts of the Epstein story and ignore others, and then deem the story having been, addressed and covered. Really, I think we're only the tip of the iceberg on this, and really, his intelligence and political ties is far, far more important even than the grave crimes he committed for which he was convicted.
I remember it was so conspicuous to me when you had that bizarre announcement by Pam Bondi. It was really Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, though they issued it in the name of the Justice Department. It was unsigned. They gave it to Politico, where they essentially said, okay, look, we investigated. No evidence there was any blackmail. There's no client list. None of these things we've been telling you for 4 years. Not only do we know is there, but the government is covering up. Turns out we looked and none of it's there. By the way, he also committed suicide. There's no doubt about that. Just sort of like brushing aside every single one of these things that particularly people on the American right had been fed as certain for so long. And the one notable omission in those denials was that Jeffrey Epstein had any relationship or worked with or for foreign or domestic intelligence. It was like it wasn't even on their radar. And then a week or so later, a reporter, when at the Oval Office, when at the White House, where Trump was meeting with his cabinet, directly asked Trump and said, is there any evidence that Jeffrey Epstein in these files, is there any evidence that he was working with foreign intelligence agencies? And that was when Trump exploded with rage and said, you people are idiots for focusing on something so trivial, which his own son and vice president a year before had said was the most important story. And then he said, Pam Bondi can answer. And she said, you know what, not that I know of, I'll look and I'll get back to you, as though like this idea had never occurred to anybody. Like, hey, maybe we should check to see if he's working with foreign intelligence. And when you think about how costly politically it is for Trump to just so aggressively conceal these files and argue for their concealment in light of everything that's happened, there has to be things in there he doesn't want to come out. And obviously one possibility is there's a bunch of his friends who are mentioned in there, or even himself, and he may think we're mentioned in there. It may harm our reputation, even though it's not really evidence or proof we've done anything wrong. But the other aspect of it, and this is generally when the government covers things up, it's because of connections to and activities by intelligence agencies that they don't want the world to see. And the silence that your reporting has provoked really is feeding this suspicion for me that a lot of these releases are kind of designed to be tantalizing as a way of saying, oh, look, don't worry, you're getting transparency, when in reality, on the most important issues, there is transparency, you're providing it, but no one is really paying attention. They're purposely kind of suppressing it.
I think that's absolutely correct. It's interesting when you look at these releases, a lot of our reporting, it's based partly on the email leaks that took place and are hosted on a website called Distributed Denial of Secrets, which is like a successor to WikiLeaks. And the emails were hacked by this pro-Palestinian hacking group some years ago. No one knows the exact identity of them. But they were released there. But those emails are only part of the story.
But
a lot
before
of
you
our
go on, I
stories
wanted to
are
ask you
based.
that. Well, just describe for people, because I've looked through these. Like, what are those leaked emails? Like, who did they hack, and where do these emails originate?
So there were several archives of leaked emails. One of them, which is comprised the bulk of our reporting, came from former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. And a lot of our stories are actually based on Barak and Epstein's interactions. This is the period in 2013, 2016, just when Barak was leaving the defense ministry in Israel. He's head of the Ministry of Defense. He was talking to Epstein while he was there, and then also even more so after he left. They were working together on these projects to promote Israeli tech, surveillance tech firms in different countries around the world, to create this, do back channel diplomacy that Epstein would help set up for Barak on behalf of Israel. They're doing all this, and there's a lot of detail in those emails, and there are a few other people who were hacked. The strong suspicion is this is part of an ongoing hacking war that was taking place between the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Israeli intelligence, where they're hacking each other and dumping the information and so forth. That's the realm of speculation. We don't really know. But, the emails actually don't tell the whole story. As much as they tell quite a bit. But really, the story is filled in when you look at the emails and the government disclosures together. Because the government disclosures, what we've seen so far, they contain Epstein's personal calendars, other emails, who he was talking to, what he was doing, and so forth. And you can look at both of them together, and the pieces start to fit together that way. But what I noticed is that in these email disclosures, the ones so far, the government, for one thing, they release the documents in a way which makes them deliberately difficult to sort of parse through. So they're creating all these artificial sort of barriers to an ordinary person, for instance, perusing them in a normal way. The major news outlets, which have resources and staff and money to devote to just going through it and systematizing it, they maybe are politically averse to covering some of these issues. And then there's a small Venn diagram of people who have like the resources and the time and the skill set who can parse through it and are professionally doing that, of which I think Dropsite is in that small Venn diagram. So we're reporting on it, but they're making it difficult. They're making it very difficult to do that. And they're highlighting, again, these very salacious emails, which I guess they pass off to a few friendly journalists. That becomes the story. and it's important, like to reiterate, it's important, the issues with Trump and sexual abuse and so forth. But then the real actual story is being occluded by these tactics, which are very canny in some way. But we're focusing in on reporting on these stories based on the emails, based on the government disclosures, specifically looking at the issue of his intelligence contacts. And there's a tremendous wealth of information about this. We've done 4 stories. I believe we'll do many, many more stories about this. And I'm surprised that other news outlets are not looking at it. When maybe they will now after we've done a couple of reports about it's gained traction. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a tremendous amount there because Epstein was, like I said, he was an unbelievably active individual. Looking at his emails and his schedule, I wonder how he had the time to get into sex trafficking because he was so busy engaging in diplomacy and business deals all over the world that one cannot imagine how an individual lives this way. And that also points to the sort of inorganic nature, in my view, of these contacts. And, very quickly, people have asked, do I think, or other people look at the emails, think that Jeffrey Epstein worked for Mossad? I actually think, interestingly, the relationship seemed to be inverted. Like it would almost maybe be more logical or accurate to say that the Mossad worked for Jeffrey Epstein, because in his relationship with Barak, for instance, who at that time was one of the most influential people in the Israeli security establishment, the power dynamic clearly seems to favor Epstein in the relationship. Barak is looking to him for help, trying to get his attention, trying to get his help making money. And they were jointly deploying these Israeli intelligence-linked commercial firms, surveillance firms, and tech firms, and also military firms around the world to do their bidding for things that they had in mind. They can make money from them, and they could also further Israel's strategic interests. That seemed like it was more like that. So Epstein, in my view, he seems like a very, very powerful individual on whose behalf he worked and whom he was answerable to. I think it's not exactly clear, but I don't think he was an employee of any state. He was someone who was above all these states, and he coordinated among what it seems like a transnational criminal organization of elites. That's the only blunt way I could put it. He was a made man in that world.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate for a second on this distinction between the salacious parts of the story and then the parts on which you're focused, which is his obviously deep connection to not just the Israeli government, but the policies of the Israeli government and advancing Israeli interests. You have, there are a lot of, let's say, Jewish billionaires. And I say Jewish billionaires because, these are people who come from a Jewish culture where you're taught from birth to, have a love for and affection for Israel. You're taught that one of your duties as a Jew is to do everything you can to protect Israel. And there are a lot of extremely wealthy Jews who have as their primary philanthropic activity working on behalf of Israel. Larry Ellison, who's the richest or second richest person in the world, who now controls TikTok and Paramount and CBS through his son, is the largest single donor to the IDF. He does all sorts of things with Israel. When Benjamin Netanyahu was out of power, he was going to give Netanyahu a very lucrative seat on the Oracle board. Then you have the 2 largest financial patrons of Jeffrey Epstein, Leon Black and Lex Wexner. Both of them are Jewish billionaires who also had as almost their exclusive philanthropic focus. By philanthropic, I just mean activities that weren't about profiting from their main companies, serving the Zionist cause, building up Israel in all sorts of ways. And so if you just sort of put Jeffrey Epstein in that category, as somebody who's a Jewish billionaire with a lot of influence, there's nothing really notable or unusual, I guess, about the fact that he was really involved with Israel, had a lot of connections in Israel, worked to help Israel as Israel perceived it. It only becomes, kind of notable and significant and exceptional if, in fact, Jeffrey Epstein was doing things other than just procuring girls for himself. And if you just look at the kind of narrow legal charges that he and then Ghislaine Maxwell faced, she was convicted on procuring girls not for a huge sex trafficking ring, but only for Jeffrey Epstein. So if we don't have the salacious parts, which we're calling it, namely that he was providing, global elites with a bunch of young girls, putting them in compromising positions, potentially blackmailing them, if we don't have that, and all we have is the stuff you're reporting, which is that Jeffrey Epstein was a big supporter of Israel and did a lot to help Israel and use his connections around the world. What is significant about that?
Oh, to be clear, I don't think that the other part is unimportant. I think the two should be viewed in combination with one another because it does raise these other questions of were people being blackmailed, and what was that adds to the criminality of the entire behavior, the fact that he was doing this. So the two things, it's not that one is important, the other isn't. That they should be treated equal resources should be devoted to covering both aspects of it. So then we can all have the full picture. But to your point, it's very interesting because there is this sort of network or community of pro-Israel billionaires who are very well known. A lot of them are, pretty public figures and so forth. But I think Epstein's a bit different because he actually wasn't one of those. He wasn't straightforward. He was pro-Israel, but he wasn't like a devoted, only caring about Israel type of guy. He had deep connections in Africa, in the Middle East and Arab countries, in Russia, obviously in Europe, in Central Asia, even, and of course in the United States. He had his hand in many, many different pies. So he was a bit more cosmopolitan than some of those people may have been. And he was using these connections to accomplish all sorts of goals. He wasn't a purely Israel focused individual. And I would actually say it's kind of interesting that in a way, like ordinary Israelis were also victims of this whole situation because their country was being used by Barak and Epstein and others as kind of like a sovereign base for them to carry out their activities, to deploy Israeli resources or state companies and so forth, individuals, for their own interests, of which Israelis didn't really share per se. People were getting rich. I think Barak was getting rich. Epstein seemed to already be very rich. He didn't seem to, at this point, need money that much. But, this was a very private enterprise from a handful of people. And, it wasn't even all necessarily for the benefit of Israelis per se. It was the benefit for some sort of network of people who actually spanned many different backgrounds. There were Arabs there were Europeans, there were, as mentioned, Africans, Mongolians even. This is all what it's about. So it's kind of, we don't really have a paradigm to discuss what this is, and a very, very clear one. But there's one last point. I haven't seen any evidence per se that Epstein was blackmailing people. I do think it's very plausible, and he did have ties with these Russian oligarchs who were known to do that kind of thing in Russia. But, another interesting thing is that I almost think that a lot of the people who he connected with, they would have almost done things for him even out of the willingness, of their own volition, the majority of them at least, because what Epstein offered people was the chance to make them rich. Barack wanted to become rich. He knew he had to come to Epstein, and Epstein could open doors for him. They wanted to have, fun, quote unquote. They wanted to be part of the bustling social scene of which he was a very important member. So I guess, he would facilitate that. So, he may have been blackmailing people, but almost, that would have been, in some cases, superfluous, in many cases at least, to get what he wanted politically, as we see in these communications.
There's no question that blackmail, especially about private sexual matters, which is what tends to generate the most attention, maybe the most embarrassment, reputational harm, is a very common part of high-level geopolitics. Certainly the Israelis use it, the Americans have used it. Countless examples that you can cite that it's not a conspiracy theory. And so, and there is an email, that is very interesting where the so-called journalist Michael Wolff, who has a lot of ethical problems of his own, was actually coaching Jeffrey Epstein on how he could use the leverage that he has over Trump and the knowledge he has about Trump's activities with Jeffrey Epstein to kind of, get what he wants from Trump or force Trump to do things or help Jeffrey Epstein in some way. So, I mean, it's not like these materials, even the limited ones that we've seen, because remember, the Justice Department has most of them and still hasn't released them. We're getting drips and drabs. There's already some blackmail talk around Jeffrey Epstein and his activities. But one of the things that really strikes me, Maz, I just want to delve into this a little bit more and get your view on it, is, I think one of the reasons that the Jeffrey Epstein case has been so captivating for so many people is because there is this perception that we're basically living under the rule of a global elite. You were kind of talking about, it's not just, Israel and the United States. There was an email today. I'm pretty sure, I didn't confirm it, so I don't want to say definitively, but I think Mohammed bin Salman gave Jeffrey Epstein a gift of some sort of carpet or rug or something. Maybe it's a little too on the nose, but I'm pretty sure that was one of the emails. But also, when Jeff Bezos' marriage broke up, it was because his WhatsApp was hacked And that was when his wife discovered he was having an affair. And there's a lot of blame that has been assigned to Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi prince. So you have, Jeff Bezos and the Saudi prince and the Emir of Qatar and the whole Persian Gulf region and these like warlords in Africa, and then these, bankers in Europe, and the entire kind of major elite system in the United States that transcends party and national interest. And I think there's a perception that people have, and there's a lot to it, that we're no longer run by kind of a national elite, but this global, international, transnational elite, and that it seems so removed from the people over whom they're ruling, and so drowning in unprecedented levels of wealth and power. Talking about people worth $350 billion who can just buy up media outlets on a dime, and the amount of money floating around in a lot of these developing countries. You go to these developing countries and you see they look way more advanced than the United States. You're talking about massive amounts of money on this global scale, and that there's something deeply depraved and deeply amoral and maybe even worse. And even independent of evidence that we may or may not have or get, that this was, some ring where huge numbers of very influential people were participating with Jeffrey Epstein and having sex with underage girls. The fact that they were on his plane and that they were at his island, and that there were all kinds of references to their knowledge that this is what he was doing. The conviction itself was a public record. What type of global elite or any kind of culture doesn't hold against somebody the fact that they were convicted of soliciting a minor for prostitution, and knowing, so he's some of that rich, and with that level of access to the best lawyers, that's a plea bargain that obviously entails a lot greater wrongdoing than the conviction itself ultimately reflected. And it's like they viewed him as not just a friend, but someone of the highest standing within this extreme mega elite world. What do you think this says about the kinds of people who really are running the world and governing our lives, well separate from and above democratic elections?
Well, they're immersed in depravity. That's the obvious conclusion. And one thing I'll say is that in a lot of the reporting we do with Dropside on these global corruption and so forth, even separate from the Epstein stories specifically, the same names keep coming up. I'm working on a story. Me and Ryan are working on a story about another African country, which we're going to publish soon. And a name came up came up in the context of a story we did about Pakistan a few months ago. Just names there's a very small little community of people, relatively small community of people who seem to all know each other. They're very wealthy. They travel. They are connected to one another in this manner. It's a very relatively small social circle. And people will say, "Well, this is conspiratorial, or you shouldn't be saying this." But the fact is, this is literally the observable data in front of our eyes. This is what is happening. These are how these people are connected with one another, and they seem to view themselves as having impunity. They have impunity to engage in very egregious activities. I would even venture that the Epstein conviction and the Epstein arrest and everything that happened is an aberration. It's probably more likely we never hear about these things, or we're not aware of everything that's happening per se, things, egregious acts like he was committing. And, to your point, the use of these sexual blackmail as a tool of political control, it's very strong. I'm very conservative in my statements, but there is very strong circumstantial evidence of what's happening in this case. And again, it's not an issue that anyone in the media really wants to discover. And part of the reason for that is we've also covered in our reporting, the media itself is very implicated. The elite media is very much part of this transnational global elite, which we're discussing. And they have close relationships with many of these individuals as well, too. And there's communications between Epstein and certain high-profile media figures. Even in these emails, we've seen other ones as well, too. We've written about them. So, that is something which is part and parcel of this. And I think it points to a broader issue that's taking place right now, that there's a collapsing trust in elites worldwide, and it's very clearly playing out in the US as well, too. And Epstein is a very important figure because what he did and what he signifies and what's not been said about him and how his story ended, it's very it's kind of a key which opens the lock on a lot of different things. It strikes at the legitimacy of what you can call the regime, quote unquote, because, he was so plugged in at the highest levels in the American elite and the global elite. He was so depraved. And as you said, people were so unbothered by his depravity. Everything we've written about was many, many years after his first sex conviction. And it seemed to have no impact on his business and personal relationships at that level. It indicts them a lot because the hypocrisy and the behavior, which is so at odds with the public perception, is just so glaring. And the inability to come clean about everything that took place with Epstein and what he did, who he was, and how his life ended, that is only furthering this collapse in trust in elites. And we're doing these stories. I thought I was pretty jaded and cynical, to be honest. So I'm doing these stories and seeing all these details. And, I think that people who just check out or they just have no faith in the system, like, I don't really blame them, because on one hand, there's so much deceit and there's so much, falsity in our public understanding of these issues. And the corruption is so broad, unfortunately, that, a lot of things which people would deem irresponsible to believe they may be true. So I think we should look at this very conservatively and be very indulgent of people, because Epstein's story is just an indictment of so much. And the more I hope we learn, the more we may come to understand how much needs to be reformed.
Are privacy concerns keeping you up at night? Because Sam Altman recently announced that ChatGPT can now reference all of your past conversations. Do you feel comfortable knowing that an AI platform chaired by a former intelligence official has access to all your thoughts and dreams? Luckily, there's a promising alternative, Venice AI. Venice AI lets you use AI without handling over your sensitive information. They utilize leading open source AI models to deliver text, code, and image generation directly to your web browser, and the interface looks stunning. There's no downloads, no installations, and your conversation history is stored only in your browser, keeping your privacy intact. With Venice AI, you can ask it to explore stimulating hypotheticals about future events, generate images without restrictions, upload PDFs for summaries, and even modify how Venice interacts with you. And with their Pro plan, you can do all of this without any limitations. I've been using Venice AI and it's been a game changer. I can ask it anything without worrying about my data being shared. It's versatile, allowing me to switch between different models and generate unique images. If you want to use AI without fear of handing over your most intimate thoughts, you can get 20% off a Pro plan using my link. It's venice.ai/Glenn. Don't miss out on this opportunity. Click the link in the description and use the code Glenn to get started today. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.